Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today, we're doing another fan-requested ship comparison. We're going to be comparing the Italian Vittorio Class Battleships to the New Jersey here. Really, New Jersey is 3 years newer and considerably larger than the Italian ship was designed to be, so it shouldn't really be that good of a comparison. However, let's see how things stack up. Vittorio was one of the first post-treaty battleships designed and built. Following World War I, there was the Washington Naval Treaty and the subsequent London Naval Treaties, which limited the size of battleships and also limited when new battleships were going to be built. So, Vittorio was the first Italian battleship built since basically the beginning of World War I, at least the first one completed, and one of the first battleships worldwide that had been completed since the 1920s. In the 1920s, the Germans built the Deutschland-class pocket battleships, which are really more of heavy cruisers than battleships, but they carried 6 11-inch guns. France was allowed to build 70,000 tons worth of new battleship, so they elected to build the Dunkirk class, which are functionally more of battle cruisers or cruiser killers than true battleships. However, they were considerably larger than the Deutschland class. Italy, which was a big Mediterranean rival of France, opted to build to the full 35,000-ton treaty limitation to outdo the Dunkirk class. In fact, even though design started with a 35,000-ton limitation, the Littorios would end up being some 40,000 tons when finally built, and a little bit heavier full load. So that compares a little bit unfavorably to the Iowas, which were designed to be 45,000 tons standard and ended up being 57,000 tons fully loaded. So the Littorios are slightly smaller. While New Jersey is 887 feet long, Vittorio is about 790 feet long or so. They're about the same width. Vittorio is 107 feet wide to New Jersey's 108 foot wide. Vittorio isn't limited by any sort of canal restrictions or anything like New Jersey was. That was just an ideal length. And in terms of draft, New Jersey is about 38 feet deep. Vittorio is only about 31 feet deep. Now, the real difference between these ships are where they're designed to operate. New Jersey is designed to operate in the vast expanses of the Pacific and be able to transition easily into the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, wherever she needs to go. So she can fit through canals, and she has a 15,000 nautical mile range and a 33-knot speed. The Italian ship pulled off a 30-knot speed. She still has a good length-to-beam ratio. However, her range is only 4,500 nautical miles, less than 1/3 of New Jersey's. These battleships are designed to operate exclusively in the Mediterranean. They are not designed to travel particularly far from the Mediterranean. Italy doesn't have any sort of worldwide presence. They don't have refueling stations. These ships are supposed to clear the French and the British or the Russians or whoever they're fighting at the time out of their portion of the Mediterranean. I don't believe the Italians ever came up with any plans to deploy any of these ships beyond the Mediterranean. I don't know that they ever made it to Gibraltar on the western end, and they only made it as far as the Suez Canal on the eastern end. I don't think they ever even got beyond that. Now, because they didn't need so much weight in supplies, fuel, boiler feed water, that sort of stuff, they were able to devote more of that to armor plating and weaponry and other stuff. Now, if you look at Littorio compared to New Jersey, they're very similar designs. They have 2 smokestacks. They have 2 turrets forward, another turret aft. They have a tower-like forward superstructure. Some immediate things that are apparent with the Littorios: their aft turret is superimposed over nothing. Part of this is because the hull is so shallow there, they needed an extra story, so they were willing to take extra top weight. They weren't really going to leave the Mediterranean and face severe seas, so they accepted the extra top weight of elevating that turret up kind of high. And that also cleared the fantail for their spotter planes. The Littorios were actually designed to take helicopters initially, although those early autogyros were not ever ready or fitted to the ships, and so they got more traditional float planes, per se. While the aircraft were launched by a catapult, Littorio didn't have a recovery system the way New Jersey and other countries' battleships did, because they're operating close enough to home that rather than stop and recover these aircraft somewhere in the mid-Mediterranean, it's easier to just launch them and have them fly back to Italy and then have them craned on board next time you're tied up to the pier. Let's see. Another visually distinct feature of the Littorios: they have a lot of rangefinders. They have rangefinders stacked all up and down their forward and aft superstructure and inside their turrets. They probably have twice as many rangefinders as anyone else's battleships. They couldn't decide which type of rangefinder was better, so they opted to just have one of each. While they had a decent number of optical rangefinders, they didn't really have any radar rangefinding abilities. These ships were basically last saw service in 1943, so they never really got the electronics fit that New Jersey got. Let's see. Anti-aircraft guns. These ships had pretty typical European mixed anti-aircraft batteries. They had 6-inch secondary guns. They had 12 of them in wing positions, similar to old pre-dreadnought battleships. It's a pretty good secondary battery. They had a tertiary battery of 90mm guns. They had a dozen of them in single barrel mountings. Those guns were okay by European standards. They don't really compare well to the 5-inch 38s on New Jersey. And then they had a mix of 37mm and 20mm anti-aircraft guns tacked on wherever they had room. And again, that was pretty decent by European standards, but not really up to snuff by Pacific War standards or anything like that. Especially in the Mediterranean, where it's so small, you are going to be attacked by aircraft. You could be attacked by carrier aircraft, you're going to be attacked by land-based aircraft, for sure. Let's see. In terms of the main battery, they were armed with 9 15-inch guns. So a little bit smaller than New Jersey's, same number of them. But, get this, whereas New Jersey's guns have a range of about 41,000 yards, a little over 20 miles, the Italian ships had a range of 46,000 yards. They had the longest ranged guns ever mounted on a battleship, in theory. Very high velocity 15-inch guns. In practice, this meant that their barrels had to be relined often, which isn't particularly terrible because, again, they're operating out of Italy in the Mediterranean, so they can always go home and refit. They're not going to be doing long campaigns in the vast Pacific like New Jersey was. However, even though they theoretically had good accuracy and good range, and a lot of fire control, their shells and powder weren't really randomly tested the way that you would in the United States. And since the people manufacturing them happened to be friends of political bigwigs in Italy, lots of shells weren't returned for being bad. So the Italian ships suffered from really, really bad dispersion. Their shells went all over the place, especially at longer range. And again, it's nothing particularly wrong with the guns. It's nothing particularly wrong with the fire control system. It's just the companies manufacturing that stuff cut a lot of corners, didn't test it, and gave the Italians Navy some subpar equipment. Another interesting thing about the Littorios, they only carried 74 rounds per gun. It was pretty standard to carry about 100 rounds per gun. And the Iowas carried closer to 130 rounds per gun, almost twice as many shells as the Littorios. The Iowa shells were about 1,000 pounds heavier, even though they're only 1 inch larger. So they would have done considerably more damage if they hit the target, even though Littorio could, in theory, get shots off earlier. In terms of armor plating, Littorio had an extremely modern system of armor plating that actually compares pretty favorably to what New Jersey had. A very similar system. Rather than going for pure thickness, and again, my rule of thumb is usually if you've got 15-inch guns, you want to armor your ship against 15-inch guns, because that's probably what the enemy has. And a 15-inch gun would take about 15 inches of armor for protection. That's a lot of weight. And the thicker your armor is, the more expensive it is, the longer it takes to manufacture. So the Italians used a system of layering very similar to the New Jersey. Watch some of our other videos that talk about New Jersey's armor. So they weren't going with a single layer. They had an inclined belt. They had several thin layers before the belt. So the armor plating compares fairly favorably. In terms of torpedo defense, it compares less favorably. The Italian ships were fairly narrow to achieve their high speed, so they didn't have the depth of protection that they needed, particularly at the ends, which is an issue that the Iowas themselves had. And they, rather than using a layered system like the American battleships, they went with something called Pugliese cylinders, which is a big, round, hollow drum inside of a big void space that's more or less floating inside of their fuel oil or their makeup feed water. And in theory, this drum is supposed to crush when a torpedo hits the side of the ship. So rather than the force of the explosion being put against the holding bulkhead and rupturing that and sending it into the engine room, the cylinder is supposed to crush. In practice, this meant that when the cylinder worked, you had to cut open the whole side of the ship and replace it, which is a lot of work. And when it didn't work, which it often didn't because it was narrower than intended, or because where the holding bulkhead met the double bottom of the ship, that riveting down there was not sturdy enough to take the overpressure. Because the cylinder was round, instead of just crushing, what it actually did was divert the explosion around the cylinder, so that it actually diverted the explosion into where the holding bulkhead meets the double bottom, which is a riveted coaming, and it would cause that to shear away because it wasn't designed to take that pressure. So then you're flooding your engineering spaces and your armored citadel. So really the system didn't work well, which is too bad because these ships found themselves being torpedoed all the time. The Mediterranean, again, not much room to maneuver, hard to hide a battleship there. So aircraft, submarines, carrier-borne aircraft, cruiser and destroyer launched torpedoes, and battleships are big and unmaneuverable, so they're a real magnet for it. Now, one area of defense that the Littorios do that's really interesting, whereas many battleships of the time, including New Jersey, had twin rudders side by side, which theoretically a single torpedo could knock that out and cause these ships to be difficult to steer. The Littorios had 3 rudders, and they were pretty well separated, and they had a rudder behind each of their propellers. So that's forcing water over the rudder, which in theory makes them pretty maneuverable. Also means that if they take a torpedo hit and it knocks out their main rudder, which happens to Prince of Wales, happens to Bismarck, probably other ships too. It's not going to knock out all of their steering. So that was really innovative, and I suspect had battleships continued to be built after the war, when different navies were able to inspect the Littorios, you might have seen this system used on more ships. Now, the Littorio design is a pretty good 1930s design. In fact, Spain wanted to build 4 of them. Russia got the plans to build some of them, and even the Dutch got the plans for them to look at in designing their own battle cruisers, which they were working on. Italy initially intended to build 2 of them. Littorio, which in 1943 was renamed Italia, and Vittorio Veneto. And then they decided to order 2 more later on when the treaty restrictions lifted. So those became Roma and Imperio. Imperio was never completed. Roma was completed about halfway through the war. Vittorio Veneto saw service throughout most of the war, at least from 1940 to 1943, while Italy was actually participating in World War II, and engaged in a number of battles in the Mediterranean with the French, with the British primarily, and even with the Germans. In fact, both ships were damaged by the Germans when Italy surrendered in 1943, and Vittorio Veneto was actually sunk by a German guided missile. So, who wins in a battle between New Jersey and Littorio? New Jersey's a little bit larger. She's got higher speed. The armor is pretty comparable throughout the 2 designs. New Jersey's guns, and particularly the shells, are heavier. New Jersey has a greater rate of fire and has more electronics for aiming those guns. And her shells actually land where her fire control equipment tells them to, unlike the Italian ships. So even though these are really, really good ships, particularly for their theater where they were designed for, you take them out of that theater and they're nowhere near as effective. So New Jersey wins out in this one. Now, if you have any questions, comments, drop them in the comment section down below. If there's another ship out there you'd like us to compare to New Jersey, let us know down below, and we'll get to it sooner or later. I'm thinking next week, unless we get some other suggestions, we're going to go with the French battleship Richelieu. Now, remember to like, share, and subscribe to see more content we're putting out. And remember to check the description down below for ways that you can support the museum and our YouTube channel. Thanks for watching.